authority of the general.
The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have the junior senator from Richmond, Senator Jennifer McClellan. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Woody.
One of the newer members of the State Senate, formerly a House of Delegates member.
Yeah.
How are you enjoying your tenure there?
So far, so good. It's in a lot of ways it's different. In a lot of ways it's the same. So
I understand it's a little bit more formal there.
it is. The House can be a little raucous. You have a lot of sound effects, and for example, on the House side, if you have a cat bill, it's not unusual for members to do cat calls, whereas on the Senate that would never happen.
So I understand you got a little bit of a bump in salary as well.
Just a little bit, yeah.
So what about your committee assignments? How do they differ from the committees you had in the House of Delegates?
In the House, I was on Education, Commerce and Labor, and Courts of Justice, which are very popular committees. On the Senate side, I'm on Local Government, Agriculture, Conservation and Natural Resources, and Transportation.
And now you have more constituents, about 200,000 constituents now?
Yes, and my district is geographically bigger. I still have the big chunk of northern Richmond, but I picked up pretty much all of eastern Henrico, all of Charles City County, and the town of Ashland and Hanover.
So what's the economy like in your district?
Very diverse. You have everything from state government employees, the seat of government, the Capitol, the financial district, downtown is all still in the district. Charles City County is a lot of farms, agricultural, rural area. In Ashland is a college town, and Eastern Henrico is maybe your typical suburbs. So I've got everything. I still have sort of $1 million mansions on Monument Avenue, and most of the housing projects north of the river, and the Chickahominy Indian tribe is there. So it's a very diverse district.
Now what about, in terms of the economy, what about dependence upon the federal government? Are there any military installations, for example, in your district?
No, but I think Virginia on a whole is very dependent on federal government spending. Particularly, we get a lot of money that comes into the state budget, a lot of grants that come through, a lot of money directly to our public school systems. The bus rapid transit project is federally funded. So there is a lot of federal spending that affects this area that a lot of people are watching with some trepidation what's happening in Washington right now.
Especially the recent announcement that there's going to be a freeze on federal hiring and pay raises.
Yes,
I take it.
yes. And I think that's particularly concerning. My understanding was there were a lot of the appointed positions that had not been filled during the transition. And so it'd be interesting to see how the hiring freeze affects that.
And of course, there's going to be at least a an attempt at dismantling the Affordable Care Act. How will that impact the state and in particular your district?
I think it'll have a huge impact on the state in a lot of different ways. I mean, everything from you know the ban on insurance companies not rejecting someone for a pre-existing condition, to kids being allowed to be on their parents' policy up until 26. You know, there are a lot of people in my district who benefited from that. Everything from there were protections in the Affordable Care Act for new mothers. There were requirements for accommodating nursing and pumping for new mothers. So if you do a complete repeal, all that goes away. But I think the bigger thing is just the fact how many people were insured because of the Affordable Care Act. And we still had a gap of about 400,000 in Virginia because we didn't expand Medicaid, but that gap's going to be a lot bigger if the Affordable Care Act is repealed altogether. And you know, all of the preventative care that increased under it, you know, that's something I'm very concerned about.
And obviously Medicaid expansion is totally off the table now. I think the governor indicated in his State of the Commonwealth address that he was proposing legislation to allow the governor's office, any Republican or Democrat, determine whether Medicaid should be expanded, assuming the Affordable Care Act survived.
Yes, and you know, unfortunately, the Republicans in the House in particular, but also in the Senate, just weren't willing to do that. But whether you expand Medicaid or come up with some other plan, there are still 400,000 Virginians that are uninsured, and that has a huge impact on the entire Commonwealth because when you're not insured, you typically don't get preventative care, and you wait until you need to go to the emergency room or something is more serious, more expensive to treat. If you can't pay for that, then the rest of us pay for it, and through higher healthcare costs. And so I think everybody agrees we need to get a handle on the costs of providing health care, and that's one piece we still struggle with under the Affordable Care Act. But if we end up with more uninsured, then the cost of providing health care is going to go up for everybody.
And that's in the wake of a current crisis that not only affects the Commonwealth but also the nation. And this is this crisis regarding opioid addiction and heroin. Talk to us about how serious that is.
It's very serious. I think the Department of Health or the Office of the Medical Examiner just issued a study that shows we're almost 1,000 deaths a year from opioid overdose. And a lot of people think that it's just heroin, but it's not. What we have found is, and you only have to look at what happened with Prince, it's a lot of people who have an injury or surgery or something, they start off on pain medication, and over time, more and more of those pain medications have been opioid-based. Then you get addicted, and one of two things happen. Either you start getting illegal access to more opioids over the counter, which is what Prince did. We don't know if it was legal, but I mean, he got more and more. Or you turn to heroin. And it is a huge crisis that everybody understands we've got to do something about. And we've got some legislation this year to try to get a handle on that. Everything from making it easier to get access to the antidote for a heroin overdose.
Is that naloxone?
Yes.
We also have a looming crisis in terms of the graying of the Commonwealth or of the nation, because as people live longer, the likelihood of coming down with, for example, Alzheimer's disease presents us with a financial burden that we may not be able to withstand.
Yes, and cancer. A lot of people don't realize my father passed away of cancer when he was 88. And
sorry about that.
That's okay. And talking with the physicians over at Massey, basically they said if you live long enough, you're probably going to get cancer. It's just a fact of life. And so There are, but you're right, Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia are a growing issue as well.
What's happened with the settlement between the Commonwealth and the Department of Justice regarding the training schools that were supposed to be shut down?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that, but I do know that's a huge problem that we have on our hands, in that the whole idea is you can't just warehouse people in a facility, that really violates their civil rights. You need to have them integrated in the community. And so we're really struggling with putting the community-based care in place to address their needs. We face the same issue with mental health, and we've struggled with that. But we need to wrap our arms around that.
What about veterans returning with post-traumatic syndrome, for example? How are we caring for them?
That's an area I'm not quite as familiar with, because I'm not on. It's mainly appropriated
Right.
the budget that we're doing that, and the healthcare. The health committees, but that is something that we are very focused on, particularly those who have traumatic brain injuries. We have had a lot of legislation in the past, or particularly through the budget, trying to increase services for them.
Family life education. I believe you have some legislation dealing with that. Tell us what that all means.
I do. So family life education is taught age appropriate K through 12. You probably remember your days in health class, and it covers a wide variety of things. Last year we passed a bill that added instruction on how to recognize and avoid domestic violence or sexual assault. There were a group of students from UVA who brought this bill to my attention and said that some of the wording of that bill really stigmatizes victims of sexual assault. Because I think the word we used was how to avoid sexual assault, which sort of puts it on the victim to say, not intentionally, but
Right.
could send a message it's your fault. So we're going to change that to prevent. But the bigger thing is we're going to add the concept of consent. Consent is necessary for sexual activity, otherwise it is a crime. They do teach that in college, but it's too late if you're hearing that for the first time. We really need to start teaching our kids the importance of consent and what happens if you don't have it.
You've been an advocate for children during your career. There's been an uptick in suspensions
Yes.
in K through 8. What's being done to address that situation?
So there's a series of legislation that just children, the children's section of legal aid has taken the lead on, to everything from not allowing long-term suspension or expulsion for kindergarten and preschoolers, requiring schools to exhaust all avenues before they expel or long-term suspend someone, limit the ability to expel or long-term suspend students for disorderly conduct, which is very vague, defining what long-term suspension is, shortening the time frame for it. This is a bipartisan package. I think all of the bills are the lead sponsor is a Republican, but there are many Democratic co-sponsors, and this is an issue that I worked on very heavily last year, and I'm co-sponsoring all of those bills.
To what extent have those policies in local school districts adversely affected minority students?
Well, hugely. So there were two studies done, one looking at the suspensions and expulsions, and another one looking at referrals to law enforcement. Virginia led the nation in referrals to law enforcement, and sometimes 6 times as many as other states.
6 times as many.
Yes. And both of those disproportionately impact students of color and students with disabilities. And some of the stories that I have heard of things kids were referred to law enforcement for or expelled for are things you and I probably did. And I think we went too far criminalizing childhood. And once you get in sort of the criminal justice system, it's not very difficult for you to stay there, and we really need to turn that around.
Were school resource officers being used appropriately in that regard, do you think?
Not always. I had a bill last year that addressed that. We require school resource officers. Their main job is to provide security and to help with truancy. But we have a grant program that also require any school resource officer funded out of it to enforce school board codes of conduct. That's not their job, and I had a bill last year that passed that removed that requirement so that they now can focus on what they're there for, to provide security and truancy. You know, that you should not have a uniformed police officer, telling students whether or not their skirts are too short.
Now, to what extent has the privatization of correctional facilities had an impact in terms of more people in our correctional facilities?
Well, my understanding is we don't have privatized correctional facilities here in Virginia, so I don't think that's been the problem. I think the main problem was in the 90s in response to Columbine, where we went to these zero tolerance policies where, if you had any drug, even if it was a Tylenol, if you had any weapon, even if you had a butter knife in your lunchbox, you automatically would be referred to law enforcement or expelled. We started to reverse some of that maybe 2-3 years ago. And now what we're seeing is, again, a lot of kids are being referred for disorderly conduct. What does that mean? Well, there was a kid in Lynchburg who's autistic who was sent to the principal's office, and on his way out the door he kicked the trash can. He was referred to law enforcement for disorderly conduct. That is not what disorderly conduct is about, but a lot of school divisions have started using it as sort of a catch-all there's a judge in Georgia, I think, put it best, that said, he's seeing the kids that make us mad, not the kids that scare us, and we need to turn that trend around.
Now, have the standards of learning reforms taken place at K through 8, and are they now migrating to the high school level?
Well, yes, we are working on that. At the high school level, we did something a little different last year. We passed a high school redesign bill that basically said the Board of Education has to come up with the profile of a 21st century Virginia graduate. What skills should they have? Now go back and redesign the curriculum to produce students that meet those, that have those skills and meet that profile. And that doesn't mean just sit in a desk learning a particular subject for a certain number of hours. We need to add in apprenticeship components, internship components. And so the Board of Ed is in the process of implementing that. And I think we will see more SOL reform this year as well.
And understand that there's a move to allow dual enrollments between our high schools and our community colleges.
Yes, yeah.
And I believe one of the positive indicators that the governor talked about over a week ago now in the State of the Commonwealth address related to the number of jobs available in the cybersecurity industry that even high school students with appropriate training can now get.
Yes, and I think we really need to focus on the fact that the industry, the economy, the types of jobs that we have are changing so rapidly. I mean, you could just looking at your iPad or your iPhone, they've only been around 10 years, and there are apps and companies, whether it's Uber or Twitter, most people wouldn't have thought about that require a different skill set than the jobs from 10, 20 years ago, and we need to make sure that we're teaching students the skills to compete in that economy as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Uber. There was a dialogue last year dealing with Uber and Lyft in terms of what kinds of rules of the road the General Assembly would come up with in terms of competition. Now you're looking at issues around Airbnb, so it seems that the law is always behind technology.
It is, and I have a bill that is similar to that. There's a new type of business called a TNC broker. There's a company here in Richmond called Userve that you can use to reserve a Lyft or Uber driver to come pick you up at a set time, because that's not part of Uber or Lyft's business model. Or you can request the specific driver. Well, the current TNC law doesn't really fit that, and so we are putting I have a bill in place to have a new type of of set of rules that apply to the broker business. But you're right. Every year there's some new innovative business model that our laws need to catch up to allow to take place here.
Seems that maybe the principles are the same. They just have to apply to these new industries.
Exactly.
What are some of the things you look at in terms to balance the interests of the incumbent against those of a new competitor?
Well, making sure that the laws are competitively neutral in particular. And one of the issues with the TNC broker, and a huge issue when we debated the Uber and Lyft bills, was insurance and whose insurance will apply and how much coverage do you need to have to make sure that the public is protected. And so we want to make sure that TNC brokers have the same insurance requirements that Uber and Lyft have. Otherwise, you give one a competitive advantage. You don't want to do that. But you also need to make sure that you are protecting any consumer interest or public interests, but finding that balance.
And I guess the same thing would apply, for example, to background checks.
Yes, absolutely.
Talk to us a little bit about transportation. You're on the Transportation Committee, and of course, people always talk about the Port of Virginia, but there's a port here in Richmond, isn't there?
There is, yes, and most of that is actually handled through the budget. So what's interesting, the Transportation Committee, we deal with a lot of traffic law and everything from bike lanes to new traffic offenses, TNC type regulations. It's a very interesting committee.
There was a lot of debate beginning in 2013 that you were part of in terms of new financing for transportation. In your opinion, how has that worked out?
Well, I was really disappointed that Central Virginia kind of missed out on that. Most of the new financing was for projects in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. And part of that was because here at the time, the localities couldn't really come together to decide if they wanted to have a regional transportation authority. Since then they have. We sort of remodeled what was RMA to become sort of a regional transportation authority here for the region. And so I think we're getting there, but Central Virginia is behind.
So how has the concept of Go Virginia aided that regionalization progress here?
Well, Go Virginia is still a little in its infancy. So I think what has really happened was a change in leadership in the localities over time that has caused the localities to be more open to working together. I mean, you've got new county managers in Henrico and Chesterfield. You have a new CAO in Richmond. You have a new mayor here in the city, new chair of the Board of Supervisors in Henrico. So that was what the real change was sort of new leadership coming in and bringing a fresh approach to regionalism. And that, I think, has really made the difference.
Now back to transportation just for a moment. I understand that there's some objective criteria now to determine where the money goes in terms of road projects.
There is, and that was through the Appropriations Committee, so I'm not as familiar with those details, but yes.
I guess some of it has to do with the mitigation of congestion, for
Yes,
example,
yes.
economic development,
Yes.
and those kinds of things.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit more about the areas in your district that are rural in nature, because I don't think many people understand that forestry, for example, and agriculture produce a lot of revenue for the Commonwealth.
They do. Forestry and agriculture are among the largest exports that we have, and all of Charles City County is in my district, and it's a very rural area that has everything from alpaca farms to sort of what used to be tobacco farms, and there is quite a bit of agriculture in eastern Henrico. A lot of people don't know that. And even you're starting to see with urban community gardens and folks in the city who want to have chickens, and I like to joke that I have urban, suburban, and rural chickens in my district because a lot of people are now wanting to sort of have their own home-based farms or eggs.
What about conservation issues on that particular committee?
A lot of issues dealing with the Chesapeake Bay. Sort of what can go in our water systems. A lot dealing with conservation of specific species. We have a lot of bills dealing with Manhattan, which is a very important fish.
Matter of fact, I think there's a move to take jurisdiction from the General Assembly in
Yes,
terms of those fish.
that bill did not pass. But the reason that I think the General Assembly looks at that is because that fish is so important, not just to the economy, through, it's used for omega-3 oils and all of that, but it's also a filter feeder. And so there are a lot of species that rely on it. And so there are a lot of people that think that the General Assembly is less politicized than the commission that governs all other species. And I'm not sure where I fall out on that issue yet, but the bill died, so we'll wait another year.
Now, what about raises for state employees? Obviously, that's a budget matter.
Yes.
The governor indicated, apparently, given the state of the budget, there will be no pay raise for state employees, maybe a one-time bonus.
Well, and I think that's under discussion now. I think there is, everybody agrees that we need to do something, particularly for state police, our teachers, a lot of our employees who have not had raises for a very long time. It's difficult to retain them. And I think there is an effort. We'll get another budget reforecast, I think, in early February. And so I think there is an effort to see if we can do raises. And I think if we can't do a raise, at a minimum, we'll do a bonus. But we're all hopeful we'll get a raise.
I take it there's a particular problem with state police because of their pay. They're being stolen by local jurisdictions, for example.
Yes, or leaving the Commonwealth altogether.
Redistricting is always a huge issue for you and other members of the General Assembly. Where is that right now?
Well, there are several bills to deal with either, there's some to have an independent redistricting commission. There are some that would put specific criteria in place that have to be followed, compactness, keeping communities of interest together. I'm hopeful that at least one of those bills will pass, but they, typically in the past they haven't. But there is a lot of grassroots organization and support for that legislation now, so this year might be different.
And there's been a lot of litigation both at the state and
Yes.
federal level.
Yes, so the congressional seats were overturned by the courts and redrawn. The House districts were upheld, but the Supreme Court is looking at that right now. They had an oral argument not too long ago. And I would expect them to strike those districts down on the same grounds they struck down, that the court struck down the congressional districts.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time and your efforts
you.
over in the State Senate, and
Thank
good
you.
luck the rest of the session.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Senator Jennifer McClellan, good to see you. Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.